Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. And it's my pleasure to be virtually with you. This year I was unable to join you, so sorry about that, but I promise that in the next years I will come again. So thank you very much indeed for your friendship and for inviting me. This is my disclosure. So this is the summary of what I will say in the next 25, 30 minutes or so. I will start with a short preamble on diabetes that everybody knows. And I will speak with you on prediction, what we are now for prediction of type 1 diabetes in children, and possibly what are the main issues related to prevention, including some considerations if we could screen or not screen for pre-diabetes in the general population in children. And I will draw some conclusions. So everybody knows that diabetes is a nasty disease in children. 500,000 of children live, more than 500,000 live with type 1 diabetes worldwide, and around now 100,000 children are newly diagnosed with diabetes in children. And it is not only the fact that diabetes is a burden for the families, but is a burden also for everyday life because of risk of acute complications. And nevertheless, a real Damocles sword on the head of these children and the family for the microvascular and macrovascular complications later in life. So that's very important that everybody understands that you know, there is a risk, a burden of type 1 diabetes in children. And when we look at the pathogenesis of type 1 diabetes, we know that actually the destruction of the beta cell, that we really still do not know exactly why the beta cell is destroyed. We know that there are autoantibodies. We will come back on that. Some viruses, possibly some strains, particularly of some viruses, could possibly enhance the attack to the beta cells. And therefore, it's very important that our understanding, molecular understanding of the beta cell destruction. To cut a long story short, what we can do and what we can say is to understand that when the child comes to the diagnosis, it's actually too late. Because when we are here at stage 3, when the diagnosis is made, actually the beta cell mass is reduced by 80 to 85%, so it's definitely too late. But what we have to understand now, that we have to distinguish stage 1 diabetes, when a child has autoantibodies against the beta cells, but still glycemia is normal, and there are no symptoms at all. The child is perfectly well. From stage 2, when there is there are autoantibodies, but the glycemia may be slightly increased or is definitely increased, but still the child has very few symptoms or no symptoms at all. And again, when we have the diagnosis, unfortunately, let me remind you that at least in my country, in Italy, 1/3 of the children at diagnosis of diabetes have actually diabetic ketoacidosis, which is a really life-threatening event, and the child can die because of ketoacidosis. So that's, again, we do need to have an earlier diagnosis, possibly in the course of type 1 diabetes in children. So again, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. You can easily understand that when we are here, not only is too late, but the progression of diabetes, to symptomatic diabetes, is already there. So again, is definitely too late. Therefore, could you could we predict the disease? The answer is definitely yes, we can. Why? Because we may have some prediction markers for type 1 diabetes in children. I will briefly mention the genetic markers, autoantibody markers, more molecular markers and beta cell function markers, which can easily or maybe can have a prediction role and to quantify a risk score for developing type 1 diabetes. So we have some information on that. Let's start with the genetic markers. Everybody knows that the HLA are important genetic markers for type 1 diabetes. Let me remind you that HLA, DR3, DQ2, DR4, DQ8 the genotypes can increase by up to 20-fold the risk to develop type 1 diabetes. Obviously, we have learned that there are other possible genes. This is the HLA, you see DR3, DR4, 70, the odds ratio is almost 17, and also DR3, DR3 is 6, etc. There are also some HLA which can protect the child to type 1 diabetes. But let me remind you that there are some other genes which can increase the risk of type 1 diabetes. Let me mention the insulin gene or the PTPN22 gene and other genes that altogether can increase the risk. The research in this field have given the opportunity to select other important gene, non-HLA genes, which are, for instance, BAC2 or interleukin-2 receptor genes, or ERBP3. There are several genes, but interestingly, my good friend Fleming Prochot recently told me, Franco, we should not get lost in translation when we speak about non-HLA genes. So to cut a long story short, HLA can still give an important contribution to the prediction of type 1 diabetes. This is a long story, really, because we know from many years now, more than 20 years, that if the child is a mother with type 1 diabetes, or particularly a father with type 1 diabetes, the risk is much increased about that. But we tried, together with Ezio Bonifacio, to understand better the risk of type 1 diabetes according to HLA and to first degree family history status. This is quite a busy slide, but just to show you that if a child has no family history of type 1 diabetes, the risk, if there is a neutral HLA, the risk of developing type 1 diabetes is similar to the general population. But if a child has a family history of type 1 diabetes and then share the HLA DR4, DQ8, DR3, DQ8, DQ2, DQ8, or DR4, DQ8, or DR3, DQ8, then the risk you can see here, DR3, DR4, DQ8, the risk is increased close to the, with no family history, close to the risk to having a father with type 1 diabetes. And if the child is a first degree relative with a high risk HLA, then, for instance, here, the risk of developing type 1 diabetes is similar to the one of the identical twin. And then, even worse, if the family history is more than one family history, one member of the family to have type 1 diabetes, and have multiple type 1 diabetes family history status and HLA at high risk, again, the risk of developing type 1 diabetes is really very high. So this is what we will know about that, and this is important to understand that. Following the genetic risk, of course, I can answer questions if somebody has some question on genes related to the risk of type 1 diabetes. Then we have the autoantibodies. you may know easily that there are several autoantibodies. What we normally do in the clinical practice when a child has diabetes is the anti-GAD antibodies, anti-IA2 antibodies. In insulin autoantibodies, the IAA are important in small children, in younger children. And more recently, the Zika autoantibodies have come to increase our understanding of the process which destroy the beta cells. So altogether, these autoimmunity, incidentally, we know that the islet cell antibodies is not anymore used. They were described by my good friend Gianfranco Bottazzo 50 years ago now, and are not used anymore. So to cut a long story short about the meaning of the autoantibodies in children, in normal children without diabetes, there are several studies. I show this one from Annette Ziegler, who collected many children, both in Germany, in Bavaria, and in Colorado, with Marian Ruers. And they were able to show that if a child has no autoantibody, then the risk of developing type 1 diabetes after 15 years is similar to the general population, which is 0.4. If a child has one autoantibody, then the risk is 30%, two autoantibodies, 62%, and three autoantibodies is up to even higher than 80%, which means that positivity for autoantibodies gives a predisposition to develop type 1 diabetes. So we can predict the developing on the basis of the type of autoantibodies. Normally we use anti-GAD, anti-IA2, and anti-insulin. And if the child has a very high titer of autoantibodies, then the risk is increased up to 85% after 5 years. So that's an important information that we should keep. Why? Because if we wanted to make an intervention, then we have a window of opportunity, which is not too much long. In other words, you can see here that if we wanted to make an intervention in order to prevent type 1 diabetes, then is mainly in preschool children. And this is the reason why when we speak about screening for type 1 diabetes in the general population, we have to focus on small children, say from 1 year to 5 years of age, in order to detect those with 2 or more autoantibodies which are prone to develop type 1 diabetes after 5 to 10 years. So that's an important issue that I want to share with you, which can obviously discuss whether or not we can screen the general population in order to detect in the general population, not only in families at risk, the risk, in fact, to develop type 1 diabetes later in life. Do we have other markers, and do new frontiers in research can give us some information about that? The answer is yes. There are several studies. This is one of those showing that we can actually understand that there are some pathways which can be very important. I don't want to bother you tonight, but for instance, the ubiquitin proteasome pathway looks like to be important in order to detect these children. In other words, when you see the distribution of some proteins, this is a proteomic approach, those who seroconvert are completely different from those who do not convert. And this is quite important to understand that in this series, in the future, we can improve our capacity to predict the type 1 diabetes and then to plan for intervention. more recently, also the CGM, the continuous glucose monitoring, looks like to be relevant to predict. In other words, you can see here briefly that those who had a timing rate actually had hyperglycemia during a CGM in the previous months, they later developed type 1 diabetes. In other words, before the clinical diabetes, we have a long phase of slight hyperglycemia, which we could possibly detect through the continuous glucose monitoring. And it looks like promising, particularly in some studies. So then if we can actually predict the onset of type 1 diabetes, or say possibly the onset of the autoimmune process which leads to type 1 diabetes, what can we do? Can we actually prevent this disease or not? There have been several studies on that. Many of you may be aware of that. There are studies about early life intervention. For instance, one of them I will show you in a minute was the milk given to the newborns and infants without beta-lactoglobulin, which looks like to have an epitope similar to the beta cell, or to use some diabetes vaccines to inject the autoantigen, for instance, GAD65, and see whether or not this can prevent the beta cell destruction, or arrest or reverse the autoimmune process in order to maintain the insulin independence. This slide shows you what we have done so far. Let me just remind you that the story of trying to prolong the remission period in children with type 1 at the onset of type 1 diabetes started in the early 80s, when there was a study showing that cyclosporine was able to prolong the honeymoon period, the remission phase period, in those treated with cyclosporine compared to those treated with placebo. But as you may argue, that this drug is not used anymore for several reasons. So what I mean is that there have been many, maybe too many trials in order either to prolong here the remission period in order in stage 3, which means the children with already clinical diabetes, or to try to prevent the developing of clinical type 1 diabetes, or to start in stage 1 with the screening of the population, those who have no hyperglycemia, or finally even earlier in those with genetic risk. Let me cut down to be tranchant here that the trial in the first period have been widely negative, and therefore we have to concentrate either in stage 1 or in stage 2. And this is probably my personal opinion. Of course, there are several studies in stage 3, but let me state, and we can discuss about that if we intervene in stage 3, as I said, is definitely too late. So we have to concentrate on stage 1 and stage 2. So why? Because obviously the mechanisms which are the basis of the autoimmune process are largely still not completely understood. In other words, every single child, every single person with diabetes is a different one, is a peculiar one. There are those who become diabetes because is mainly the beta cell which has these functions, and therefore we should detect these patients and try to start therapeutic strategies targeting the beta cell, Other children may have more problems with the immune system, and therefore maybe we have to start treatment with monoclonal antibodies targeting specific cytokines or specific chemokines. That's the very issue that we have to understand. And in line with this, I was to share with you one of the most promising results that have been done been obtained in studies. This is a study which was published some years ago inside the TrialNet, which is a network of trials in the United States. And they were able to demonstrate that these anti-CD3 antibodies called teplizumab in relatives at risk. So we are speaking about children or adolescents with a family history of type 1 diabetes. And you can see here that those who got teplizumab compared to those who got the placebo, after 5 years, the difference is relevant. And the effect, of course, of teplizumab was to reduce the lymphocyte count, and also was an important issue on how the CD3 were modified by teplizumab compared to placebo. What was quite interesting in this study that was that the persons or the children most likely to respond well to this drug were those with DR4 positive, DR3 negative, and without anti-zinc antibodies. This is a starting of stratifying the patients in order to detect those which possibly may have a better response to the treatment. In fact, these patients with DR4 positive, DR3 negative, and without these anti-zinc antibodies were those who responded better. Up to 7 years were obtained of delay of type 1 diabetes, clinical type 1 diabetes. So the trial was continued for another year. And at the end, the median delay to type 1 diagnosis with this drug was around 3 years. But again, if we could have selected better the patients, particularly those with DR4 positive, DR3 negative, and without zinc antibodies, probably we could have prolonged further. And that's the reason why, after a long story, I have the pleasure to announce you, this is a mistake here. Last November 2022, sorry for the mistake, the Food and Drug Administration approved the teplizumab in order to delay the onset of stage 3 type 1 diabetes in adults and children older than 8 years with stage 2 type 1 diabetes. Again, I remind you, stage 2 are those children with 2 autoantibodies and with the dysglycemia with no symptoms. So this is one of the reasons why now the FDA have finally approved, and we hope that also the European Medicine Agency can approve the drug in the next weeks in order to make available in selected patients for treatment. You can easily understand that this changes our perspectives in prevention of type 1 diabetes. In other words, now we have a drug available in children with pre-symptomatic type 1 diabetes, so we can do something in these children in order to prevent type 1 diabetes, clinical type 1 diabetes. There are other clinical trials. We are part of a trial in children with anti-thymocytes globulin. There is evidence in adults. This is one of the studies done with anti-thymocytes globulin, a low dose anti-thymocytes globulin, and there are also other trials with low doses of interleukin-2. So there is hope in this field that we can find we can find better drugs in order to prevent type 1 diabetes. So maybe that in the next years, we will have good news for prevention of type 1 diabetes. Why?
Franco,
Yes,
how many minutes do you have? We are shortage.
2 minutes, 1 minute, 1 minute. So we finally have trials, just to let you know that we need networks. We have 2 networks. One is in Nodia in Europe, and one is TrialNet in the United States. So, ladies and gentlemen, there is hope for the future of these children. If you want to participate in this trial, you can do that, you can apply, and this is important to give hope to the children with diabetes and their families. If you want to email you, I'm happy to share with you some more information on this very issue. Thank you very much indeed. Shukran, shukran.
Thank you very much for your marvelous talk. I think there is a bright future for diabetes, either for type 1 or type 2. And I would like to thank you in the name of all our people here for your generosity and having you with us. I think for the shortage of time, we have heard you. And if there is one quick question for Professor Franco, it's okay. If not, is there any one quick question for Professor Franco? So I think we are looking for a bright future, that this has been approved to check for the stage 2 in these patients, and maybe we can do a better for these children. Thank you, Professor Franco, for sharing us.
Thank you very much indeed. Shukran.
Shukran.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.